Okay, hi all, and welcome back to the second of this week's screencasts. I hope you're all doing well. Now, in the previous one, we looked at the week's learning outcomes. We looked at the reasons why you should study US foreign policy, and we also explored the 5 key questions that emerged from all of this. Now here I don't want to spend time recapping the first one, so I'm just going to jump into this second screencast here, where we'll look at the sort of a structure of a module overall. We'll look at the readings for each week, and we'll also touch on the assessment for the module. But these are some of the things we can also talk about in class a little later on this week, as it were. Okay, well, here we have 13 weeks of class, which means the module doesn't really fit too neatly into one semester at all. So this essentially runs across both autumn and spring terms. So we start this week, which is week 3, I think. I'm pretty sure it is. And we run right the way through until week 5 of the spring term. So each week, as you'll know, you'll have one online lecture, 2 to 4 screencasts that sort of act as that wider lecture that I've mentioned before when taken together. And you'll have one seminar where you'll be expected to share your thoughts on the questions that sort of naturally flow from the lecture and the reading materials. Each week, I'll try to also add the seminar slides to Blackboard before the first class on I think it's Wednesday this term. There's some on Wednesday, some on Thursday, and some on Friday. But I'll be sure to add those slides before the Wednesday class. And these will sort of list specific questions for discussion around which our sort of the seminar will essentially be based. And I just tend to find that class flows a little bit better if we have a sort of a clear structure that we can all see and understand from the start. And students in the past have generally said that they sort of kind of find this to be quite helpful as a sort of learning tool and guiding us through the seminar discussion. So the slides will probably have they will have the questions on them, but also some sort of maps, maybe statistics, and maybe a quote or two that should sort of guide us through the discussion for that particular class. Okay, so let's now just take a quick run through the 13 weeks of class that comprise the module. This is, of course, all in the module outline, so you can find it there too. But I think it's just useful in week 1 to take a quick run through each week and say a few words about each specific topic. I've also listed the key readings for each week in the module outline, and while I usually put 2 or 3 chapters or articles as required reading, you don't really need to read all of these. Really, you just need to go through one of these in your own time. So essentially just pick one of these, any which suits you, and that will be fine, as it were. And I should also note, and given the slightly unorthodox year that we're having, and given that sort of like physical library access might be slightly problematic this year, I've tried to sort of change things around for 2020, 2021 and make sure everything is available either as a PDF on Blackboard, either as an ebook with the university library, or I'll be kind of providing specific links to online journal articles that Reading has access to. Hence, readings should not be a problem at all this term. So in terms of where we are now, this is indeed week 1. I'm just going to try and use a tool to highlight that. And you already know what we're looking at this week, but be sure to do the reading from Desmond King here, which is listed on the slide. This essentially relates to those core questions that I flagged up in the previous screencast on the US as an empire, and a question of US imperialism, as it were. Now in week 2, once we move into where we are next week, and I apologise these lines aren't particularly straight, but when we move into week 2, which is traditions and debates in US foreign policy, we'll be starting to explore some sort of elements of the sort of traditions and these core debates across time, as it were, that relate to all elements of US foreign policy. In particular, we'll look at what the US essentially tries to achieve through its foreign policy. So in the first question here on the slide, and we'll try to look at this in a structured way and through a structured lens, what is often called the 4 Ps framework, as it were. And this framework essentially covers the importance of American military power. It essentially touches on the US's search for international peace. It works through the ways in which America essentially seeks prosperity, and we also look at the question of American principles and the way in which the United States essentially seeks to export a certain number of ideological principles, most notably, however, democratic liberalism. And in many ways, this week is really quite important as it provides a structured way of thinking about what US foreign policy and US power is essentially for. So that's essentially what I want to get out of that week, the week that follows this one. As well as this, however, I also want us to think about how the US sees the world and the international system in a way that clearly differs from a European mindset. And here we'll think about the work of Robert Kagan. This is on the slide to the left here. And we'll think about his 2003 work, Paradise and Power, in particular. And here he argues that the US and Europe really don't see foreign policy, they don't see power, and they don't see international relations or international affairs in the same way. And in many ways, these divisions of these sort of divided elements between the US and Europe contribute to many of the core disagreements between Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin. Okay, in our third week of class and the third week of the module, we explore one of the other core central questions, and that is, who makes US foreign policy? Now, this is really quite an important topic to consider before we move on to the broad historical narrative of the development of US foreign policy since 1945, as we really need to be conscious of the central players who create and implement all of this. And what I really want us to take from this week is the ways in which Congress, the US presidency, the Supreme Court, public opinion, and even the media impact on the ways in which US foreign policy is essentially made. Ultimately, though, the central narrative here is the way in which the presidency, or essentially the executive branch of government, has taken on more and more power in terms of the development of the execution of policy over time, largely at the expense of Congress and the circumstances that have led to this, and the broad implications of this for US foreign policy since 1945. And really, one of the key things to take from the module is the significance of that change, as it were, the a change in the drift away from Congress towards a presidency when it comes to the implementation and essentially the development of US foreign policy. As I put on the slide here, we need to be very conscious as why this is the case, why has this happened, and that's one of the core things to take away from that week as well, the exploration of exactly why this is the case. In week 4, so as we move across down to the slide here, on week 4, we'll begin a historical narrative of US foreign policy and how this developed after the end of the Second World War. So this week we'll look at the circumstances that the US faced with the winning of World War II, so this second point here. We'll look at the immense problems this created and the great question that emerges from the winning of World War II is essentially, how should the US seek to engage with its wartime ally, and that is the Soviet Union. Now, these moments after 1945 are highly important to explore and reflect upon, as in many ways they laid the very foundations for the blueprint of US foreign policy that essentially lasts for the 1940s, the 1950s, and through into the 1960s, as it were. Yet, the questions that are raised by this are highly complex. As the Soviet Union, and this is really that key question that the United States is struggling to get to grips with, But the Soviet Union is no normal state, and its behaviour was exceptionally difficult to predict and understand. And of particular note, however, here are the ideas and the writings of George F. Kennan. This is a figure you're going to have to get to know a little bit about as we progress through the module. But Kennan is essentially the US's chief diplomat in Moscow at the end of the Second World War, and it really is George Kennan who lays the foundations of a policy that comes to be known as containment. Hence, during this week, we'll focus a good deal on George Kennan and this keystone element of post-war US foreign policy that conditioned America's international behaviour at the outset of the Cold War. Okay, there's a bit more room on the slide here, so I'll turn my camera back on. I'm never quite sure whether it's beneficial for you guys to have the camera on or not. Maybe we can kind of talk about that in class at some point, your preferences for these videos. I'm happy to do them all as a camera or all just as a sort of a voiceover, but I'll be kind of keen to get your views over maybe this week and next, as it were, on which sort of format you prefer. But anyway, kind of we carry on our sort of tour of the module. Once we move into week 5 of the module, we'll sort of jump forward a little bit in time and focus on one of the seminal moments in US foreign policy during the early years of the Cold War, and that is the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Now, this crisis that essentially lasts around about 100 days was probably the closest that the US and the Soviet Union came towards the advent of nuclear war throughout the years of the Cold War. In fact, many historians, and I think they are probably correct on this, argue that this was probably the most dangerous moment ever in human history, and there's essentially, certainly something in this. So it essentially sees the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, secretly place nuclear missiles in Cuba, just round about 100 miles from the US mainland, which meant that most sort of major US cities were now within range of Soviet nuclear warheads. And once JFK, President Kennedy, who's on the slide here, once he learns of this, the world essentially sits on the brink of nuclear war for much of October 1962. And I've also kind of put on the slide here as well, I'll need to change that to black rather than white. So the outcome and the legacy of this event is really quite important to keep in mind and consider, because it really has broad implications moving forwards. So in week 6, following from this, the second sort of broad part on the slide here, we move forward a little in time and consider the other seminal events of the 1960s or 1960s US foreign policy, and that is the Vietnam War. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Vietnam War, a war that essentially rages from around about 1965 through to 1973. And in many ways, this is the most painful moment in US foreign policy history, as it were. It's a war that essentially the US fights against communist expansion in Southeast Asia and against much protest from international allies and domestic opposition alike. It's also a war that, from a standpoint of 2020, still today it looks irrational and reckless, and I kind of generally say that as my academic opinion on the war in Vietnam. And it's also a war that I think the US comprehensively loses, but it's one that really has a long-lasting impact on subsequent US foreign policy moving forwards. So in this week, we'll look at why the US is involved in the war. We'll look at why the US largely loses a war and what essentially goes wrong from a sort of strategic and a tactical perspective. And again, we'll have a look at how this seminal event casts a shadow over American foreign policy following the 1970s, the 80s, into the 90s, and arguably still through to the present day in 2020. Now, as we move into the 7th week of the module, we look at US foreign policy during the 1970s, and hence sort of US foreign policy essentially in the shadow of Vietnam, as I've kind of clearly noted here. Now, from 1945 through to 1965, there had been a good deal of domestic consensus on how the US should approach the Cold War world. But when sort of Vietnam went as it essentially did, it sort of shatters that sort of that sort of consensus as to how US foreign policy should look in terms of that sort of grand strategy in approaching the Cold War world. And it essentially falls to Richard Nixon and his right-hand man, Henry Kissinger, to essentially first bring an end to the war in Vietnam. Second, to essentially forge a better relationship with the Soviet Union and indeed China at this point. And this is why the photograph on the slide here is essentially capturing President Nixon's visit to China. But also he's keen to develop a clearer and more coherent level of foreign policy. And I'll just be pretty blunt on this. For me, and I agree with quite a few other academics on this, but Richard Nixon is probably the most strategic thinker of foreign policy of anyone really since 1945. I think he's highly underrated, as it were, and I will say quite a few positive elements about his foreign policy of the late 1960s and the late 1970s. But essentially, with Vietnam, with the Cuban Missile Crisis taken together, Nixon and Kissinger essentially feel that the United States has lost its way in foreign policy and that the United States essentially needs a new focus. And what they essentially zeroed in on was a question of arms control, and that is essentially the limiting of nuclear weapons and the establishment of a number of nuclear treaties between Washington and Moscow. Hence, much of this week we'll essentially look at the logic behind this. We'll look at the advent of what's known as the SALT talks. Those are the strategic arms limitation talks, and the ABM treaty, or the anti-ballistic missile treaty of 1972. And we'll also touch on the foreign policy of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter a little bit too, as it were, but I don't want to say too much on those because it takes away from our focus on President Nixon. But as much as Nixon takes up a large chunk of the 1970s, in our 8th week of class we move on to the 1980s, and we essentially explore the foreign policy of Ronald Reagan. And here we'll essentially be looking at both Ronald Reagan and a little bit of George Herbert Walker Bush too. But here we'll essentially explore how the foreign policy of the 1970s has much to commend it, at least from a sort of a theoretical and maybe an academic perspective. But for many Americans, it was a sort of difficult and confusing time. It lacked a sort of a core moral element to it. In other words, the US had sort of struggled against communism in the 1950s. It struggled against communism during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War. But Nixon had then sort of gone on to get friendly with the sort of, I suppose, Beijing and Moscow during this time. And to people like Ronald Reagan, this really makes very little sense, as it sort of accepted that communism was here to stay in the international system. And in many ways, and that's what the title of this week is about here in terms of killing the Cold War. Essentially, Ronald Reagan, to my mind, essentially revived the Cold War tensions in order to essentially kill the Cold War and bring the Cold War to an end. Hence, here we'll look at why he did this, how he sought to sort of end the Cold War through a number of maybe odd initiatives to our eyes, and these are things like the Strategic Defence Initiative that was often called, sort of derided as sort of Star Wars in a sort of in a sort of crazy sense, because much of his foreign policy was about satellites and lasers and these slightly crazy things. But in some ways there is some method to his madness, and we'll have a look at that element of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy during week 8 of the module. Okay, now once we move into week 9, we sort of move to explore the US foreign policy in the 1990s, and this is US foreign policy mostly under George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush Sr., and Bill Clinton. Now I've put these two together as in sort of many ways it's these presidents who handed one of the most difficult questions of post-1945 US foreign policy. And that question is, what should US foreign policy look like after the Cold War? If you think about it, the Cold War had sat at the heart of US policy planning essentially since 1945, with the US's military, its diplomatic and intelligence agencies, all heavily sort of focused on the Soviet threat. Yet when the conflict comes to an end in 1989, it just wasn't entirely clear what this essentially meant and what the sort of response to this essentially should be. So it's this that I really want us to kind of think about as we sort of move through into this week on the 1990s. Now, both men took very different approaches to US foreign policy during their specific tenures, with the sort of a Gulf War of 1990 through to 1991 dominating the foreign policy of President Bush, and Clinton sort of becoming very wary of deploying any troops abroad, especially after the fiasco in Somalia in 1993. We'll maybe say a little bit about that on the module, or you can just go away and watch the film Black Hawk Down, which kind of captures the essence of that pretty well, that pretty disastrous moment in US foreign policy in Somalia in 1993. Yet the end of a Cold War essentially presents more questions than it sort of answered. And with the shadow of Vietnam still hanging over the country, we explore this sort of seminal moment of the 1990s. Also here we'll spend some time on essentially what became known as the war on drugs and the US's relationship with both Mexico and Colombia, and essentially the narco cartels of Latin America. And just in case you're wondering who the guy is on the slide over here, this guy is, as many of you may know, this is the notorious Colombian drug lord and narco-terrorist Pablo Escobar, who the US were desperate to get in order to prevent the flow of cocaine onto the sort of American streets of Miami and New York during the 1980s and through into the 1990s. It doesn't really work. They do actually, in the end, help to capture Pablo Escobar, and no, not capture. He's actually killed during an attack on a compound, as it were. But they do manage to get their man, as it were. But it doesn't really stop that sort of flow of drugs into the United States in the 80s and the 90s. But I think it's worth flagging up at this point, just because it shows a sort of a movement away from thinking about those sort of broad Cold War questions and more towards sort of policy at home and how to stop a sort of flow of drugs from Latin America onto America's streets, as it were. As we move down onto week 10, as we have on the sort of the bottom of the slide here, do I need to highlight you? Yes, I do. Week 10 in the module essentially goes on to explore the 2000s, so foreign policy is starting to come into your lifetimes now. And here we place sort of focus squarely on the foreign policy of George W. Bush, or George Bush Jr., and essentially the war on terror in particular. Now, the obvious sort of question that flows from this focus is the question of how the US should have responded to the 9/11 attacks in 2001 and on the World Trade Center in New York in particular. As such, we explore the Bush's administration's criticism of sort of the timid nature of US foreign policy in the 1990s, and we look at what essentially becomes known as the Bush Doctrine and some of sort of the highly questionable moral elements of the way in which Bush executed a war on terror during the 2000s, and the question specifically of enhanced interrogation techniques. And this is quite important for the module, and especially the assessment, as all this leads us nicely into the simulation that takes place the following week. Okay, so this is the last slide on the module structure, so kind of stay with me, as it were. So week 11, we have our simulation that will be a 2 or 3 hour session, depending on what I can get from timetabling. Things are slightly up in the air, as you can probably appreciate in a moment, but we'll need to have a 2 or 3 hour session sort of face to face to run through this simulation. But essentially, the simulation will be a simulated National Security Council meeting. And I'll say more on this in due course, and there will be a document on Blackboard that explains how this will run. But essentially in this session, you'll each be assigned a position on the US National Security Council, such as Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Director of National Intelligence, or the Vice Presidency, whatever it may be. But in the simulation, each of you will be offering advice to the President on how he or she should sort of proceed when confronted with a difficult choice that concerns the war on terror, national security and intelligence gathering, and essentially one that pits morality, national security, international law and international opinion essentially against one another. So in this particular instance, what I want us to look at is to explore the real world scenario that President Bush was faced with after 9/11 and the sort of extent to which he went to gather intelligence during the war on terror. For this week, there will actually be no lecture, as a whole class will essentially be taken up by the simulation itself. But I think it may be useful to say a little bit more about this in class this week and as we sort of progress through the early weeks of the module. But the simulation is actually quite a fun process. A lot of students tend to say they find it quite an interesting and exciting part of the module. And I'll try to act as the US President, as it were, and I'll be getting all of you to sort of offer a specific advice to me, as it were, on how things should proceed when we look at our specific scenario, which, like I say, we'll talk about a little further on down the line. Now, on the slide here, we have our final 2 weeks of the module. And here we'll explore 2 separate issues. So in week 12, we'll look at contemporary foreign policy, essentially under Obama and Trump, before finishing the module with a question that concerns us today, and that is the question of American decline. And by this, I mean, for many scholars today, they argue that the US is in some sort of decline, and this is largely an irreversible trend. And given how unpopular maybe Bush and Trump are, this is often seen as a sort of welcome phenomena, with Washington wielding less power and less influence in the international system. Yet scholars such as Robert Kagan, across most of his works, argue that we really should be rather very wary of wishing for this to be the case, and for the nature of international relations to be kind of unstable as the United States maybe becomes weaker, as it were. So what Kagan essentially argues during this week is that actually we shouldn't really be welcoming or wishing for America to decline in power or in influence at all, as it were, because the sort of a likelihood of this happening is not that the world will become more peaceful and better. On the sort of the contrary, he argues that the world will become a sort of a more dangerous place and a place that tends to be more dominated by autocratic regimes such as China and Russia, as it were. So although we'll spend a lot of time critiquing America and US foreign policy in particular during the module, I think it's quite a useful question to reflect upon at the end of all this, and that is, should we really welcome less American influence and less American power in the international system today? And that's sort of where we'll end the module, as it were. Okay, well, that concludes the overview of the module, and hopefully this gives you a sort of a clear insight into the things we'll look at, and the ways in which we'll explore those 5 sort of key questions that I sort of brought up in the previous screencast. So to finish off this week, I'll just say a few words about the assessment for the module, all of which is relatively straightforward and simple. So there are essentially 2 elements to this. There's one sort of 3,000-word essay on the set questions that are listed in the module outline, and there's one simulation report also with 3,000 words that you'll write after we've gone through the simulation, which is in week 11 of the module, which I think will actually tally as what's that going to be? That's going to be week 3 of the spring term, I think. I think I'm right on that, but we'll check. We'll check in the seminars this week. Of course, as we're sort of in week 1 of the module, There's not much reason to worry about these for now, but it is worth going over these in a little bit of detail. So the essay itself is sort of a standard piece of writing, and you're essentially free to choose from any of the questions that are listed in the module outline. And these essentially range from the more theoretical questions through to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, nuclear arms control, the war on terror, foreign policy under Barack Obama. Just about most elements of the module are covered by those questions. And you'll notice I've not really said anything on President Trump, and this isn't really because he's an unpopular president or that I have little love for him. I really don't think he's a particularly great president at all, and I could probably use stronger language than that. But this is the sort of the absence of a question on Donald Trump is rather the sort of the reflection of a sort of a dearth of articles and material on him, and this sort of makes him quite difficult to write on, especially from a student perspective, as it were. And we will talk a little bit about Donald Trump on the module. But please, I'll just say this now: don't let your views on one particular president cloud all your judgments on all US foreign policy, stretching backwards into time, as this really won't make you a better student of US foreign policy, as it were. So you might not particularly like Donald Trump, and that's a perfectly reasonable position to hold, but don't let that sort, like I say, cloud your judgment on everything else. It's not a particularly useful way to proceed. But anyway, for each essay, please make sure that you answer the question. Try to keep narrative to a minimum, and always be sort of sure to offer a clear thesis statement in the introduction, and engage with some of the sort of the core academic literature in the field. I'll also do a sort of a specific essay screencast around Christmas time, so this will give you a little more guidance on the things to look out for when writing these. So I will give some clear guidance a little further on down the line. Now, as for the simulation report, I'll also do a screencast on this in due course. But be sure to look at the simulation document when I post it a little later on this semester, probably round about reading week, as it were. But I'll also, I'll just have to clear this with the department. I think I'm allowed to do this, but I'll post 3 papers from last year's cohort, as they serve as a really quite a good example, as it were, of how these should look. So once these are up, I'll alert you to their presence on Blackboard. But I'd sort of encourage you to take a little bit of a closer look at these once they're up on Blackboard. So in the actual simulation itself, we'll be aiming to essentially replicate a meeting of the US National Security Council. And I know I'm going to repeat myself slightly here, but I think this is worth stressing. So we're essentially trying to replicate a National Security Council meeting, and we'll be looking at the question of interrogation, and each of you will be allocated a position on the National Security Council. Now, I think it's just worth saying a couple of words about the National Security Council. Now, the NSC, we tend to sort of abbreviate National Security Council to the NSC, but this essentially is an advisory body that offers guidance, information and advice to the President in his decision making on all areas of foreign policy. And after we've gone through the simulation, you'll need to write a report that relates to this from the perspective of the role that you're playing, whether this is Vice President, head of the CIA, the US Ambassador to the United Nations, or whatever it may be. Now, each position is actually important, as you'll be constrained essentially by the primary considerations of that post, whether it's diplomatic in nature, whether it's more concerned with military matters, or even if it's the President's chances of re-election. So there'll be a lot of sort of competing views on what the President should do, but largely looking at things from a very kind of specific area, as it were, intelligence, diplomacy, or whatever it may be. So this tends to generate quite a lot of conflict in the simulations, as it were. But the simulation itself will essentially replicate the choices that President Bush was faced with in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And hence they sort of involve decisions on intelligence gathering, national security, and the US sort of moral standing, as it were. Now there is a short video linked on the slide here, which gives a sort of an overview of the decision that we'll be looking at, which is definitely worth watching. And maybe if we've got time in the seminars this week, just flag that up and maybe have a quick look at this, just to kind of get the ball rolling on the simulation material. But as for the report itself that you'll be writing, this is split into 3 sections. There is a position paper, a kind of a situation paper, and a policy paper. Now the position paper should be round about 500 words long, and is simply nothing more than an overview of the role that you're playing. So a sort of a kind of a brief overview of the Secretary of Defense, of a Secretary of State, as it were. The situation paper should be round about 1,000 words and gives an overview of the situation we're looking at as you see it, as it were, and a sort of discussion on the policy options that the president should be considering, as it were. So laying out option A, B, and C, as it were. How should the president, or what sort of things should the president be thinking about? And finally, and probably the most important part of the simulation report, is the policy paper, which is 1,500 words long, and is essentially a 1,500 word paper, essentially advocating 1 or 2 specific courses of action, and writing a justification as to why the president should be pursuing that course of action, and maybe saying a few words about bad options, as it were. What should the president not be doing, and why should he not be pursuing that course of action? Again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in due course, but for now I hope this gives us a bit of a heads up on the simulation report itself. But anyway, okay, well, I think that's pretty much it. That's all I have. That's the end of everything I want to kind of talk about across these 2 screencasts, and essentially this concludes things for the first weeks of the module. So next week we'll sort of get into some of the key themes and traditions and debates on US foreign policy, and we'll read a little from Robert Kagan. But for this week, your tasks are first to do the reading from Desmond King, the 2006 reading about American imperialism, called "When an Empire is Not an Empire." Also, be sure to watch the video from Howard Zinn. Take a look at the simulation report material. Maybe if time, watch the video from Model Diplomacy on enhanced interrogation techniques, President Bush in US foreign policy. This is stuff that relates to the simulation report, and of the simulation we'll be looking at kind of in January of the module. But anyway, I've thrown a lot of information at you this week. Hopefully a lot of it will be quite clear. Some of it might not be too clear, as it were, but I'll see you all in class later on this week, whether that's face to face, I think that's most of you, or whether it is online. And any questions we can kind of talk through. We can talk through the material there. So that's all I have for this week. So take care, everybody, and I'll see you all soon. I hope you all have kind of a wonderful week of term. So take care. Bye bye.